Casa, and I'm thrilled to have these two ladies here to speak to you all. This is the Jane and Jane Thompson, Jane Malpass, the authors of the book, and all of you, as part of participating in this training session, you get one of their books to take home. So let me introduce your speakers today. Jane Malpass has served as a social work consultant for the North Carolina Division of Social Services since 1980, providing case consultation and training in all areas of child welfare services for county departments of social services. She holds a master's degree in counseling and has 27 years experience in the child welfare field as a social worker, supervisor, director of family violence, program trainer, and consultant. Jane has frequently testified in court as an expert witness on permanency planning and best interest issues. She has been a regular presenter along with Jane Thompson at the annual conferences of both National CASA and a dozen other state CASA organizations across the United States. Ms. Malpass is the parent of 6 children, several of whom are adopted. Her husband is the guardian ad litem administrator for the North Carolina Judicial District. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
Jane Thompson holds a law degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Since 1981, she has served as a child welfare attorney with the North Carolina Attorney General's Office. In that position, she consults with and trains 33 county departments of social services on all aspects of child welfare services and has litigated dozens of juvenile court cases. Jane has provided mandated legal aspects training for social workers in North Carolina and currently provides legal aspects of adoption training. Jane has served on the North Carolina Supreme Court Permanent Families Task Force in the Adoption Study Commission of the North Carolina General Assembly. Pursuing one of that commission's recommendations, she served on the draft committee that rewrote North Carolina's adoption law. Ms. Thompson is active in the North Carolina Association of Social Service Attorneys and has worked on the Court Improvement Project Legislation Committee. Ms. Thompson is the parent of 2 daughters, both of whom are adopted. Her husband is an attorney and a business consultant. We are thrilled to have them here to speak to you. I think that you will gain a tremendous insight into the many very difficult issues that you face as advocates.
Let's ready to rock and roll here. Okay, my name is Jane Thompson. I'm the lawyer half of this team. I did attend the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, so go Heels at all times. You stole our football coach. We may never forgive you, but it's all right. At any event, and Jane is the social work part, and we want to introduce ourselves very briefly because we've got a lot we want to say. I am the attorney. I got out of law school and had absolutely no intention of doing any of this. I went to work with the Attorney General's office because it was the first job I could find, and that was fine, and then it was time to move to a different part of North Carolina, and I said, that's really okay with me. I have no children, my husband's an attorney, and it's time for me to be a real lawyer. I need to find a real law job in a law firm, you know, billing quarter hours, getting carpal tunnel syndrome. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And, but I didn't have anything right in mind, and the bottom line is that this job was actually available where we were moving only for 9 more months. It was going to die for lack of federal funding at that point. And I said, this is perfect. Any idiot can do juvenile law. How hard can this be? I took this course in law school. It was kind of interesting. This will be perfect. I can figure this out, and then I'll find my real job. And it did die at the end of that 9 months, and one day before it died, the Children's Home Society called me, and they had an itty-bitty little baby. And she didn't have much hair. It's now blonde, and she's 23 and a college graduate and working and paying most of her bills. I know any of you who are in that setting can appreciate that. We're moving in the right direction. And you know what? I stopped work for a while, and I took care of her, and when I was ready to come back to work, this job had morphed into a permanent state position, and I took it and never looked back. Because, folks, this is the realest law there is. This is it. This is where my passion, hopefully, meets my skills. It is certainly something that I have not tired of, no matter how frustrated I have gotten, since 1981 when I took it. So we're thrilled to have you here, and one of the reasons we do it is because we believe we need to be a team, and we need want to show you how to be a team. You know, you are volunteers. I don't care if it's a social worker, I don't care if it's the attorneys or the judge. We've all got to work together in this system. And one of the things I always tell folks, my husband's a business attorney. Very boring. But he loves it. And so he understands what his companies do. He understands. If you represent widgets, he understands widgets. I represent social services. I need to understand social services. I need to understand what is happening to children in our system. I need to understand, or I'll never be able to advocate. And you've got to understand, or you'll never be able to advocate. So, of course, I hooked up with one of the best social workers there is, and have osmosed a lot from her.
I am the social worker part of this team, and pretty pleased about that. No matter what job I had, I always identified myself as a social worker. Even after my husband became the garden ad litem administrator and we had this mixed marriage going on, it was...
kind of like Carolina Duke, you know?
I trained him, so he's good to go. And
or maybe Texas.
Yeah.
OU.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
But we... Jane and I got together years ago when we realized we were really saying the same thing, but we were saying it to different groups. And we were saying it from slightly different perspectives. I was talking from the social work perspective, and Jane was talking from the legal perspective, and there was a piece missing from each of our presentations. So today, you're going to hear me talk from the social work perspective, but also from the legal perspective. We're interchangeable. We finish each other's thoughts. Linda asked how we did our presentation, and I said chaotically. So one of us breathes while the other talks, and that's how we get through all this material. My background is in social work. It's the only thing I've ever really done. I started out as a caseworker in the Department of Social Services and kind of worked my way up through the ranks, so to speak, and then became a consultant. And somebody asked me years ago, why did you become a social worker? You know, that's the question they ask new social workers now, bless their hearts. They don't know. It's because there was a job there, I think. But the reason I became a social worker, I realized in my old age, was because I am just generally nosy. And actually, that's a very good trait for a social worker or a CASA volunteer to have. You got to want to know about people and how they tick and what makes them work and why they do the things they do. That's endlessly fascinating to me. And some of the things we're going to talk about today will help you get some tools and ideas about how to tell what makes people tick. Because as old as I am, I'm not sure I know even what makes me tick. So it's a continuous seeking journey. About 20-some years ago, Lee and I decided to put our money where our mouths were, and we adopted older children from the child welfare system, and that's where my real education began. So both in the book and in this presentation, you're going to hear about, well, both our children, but my children taught us the lessons first. Thank you very much. I appreciate that from them. I learned more from them than I ever learned in graduate school or in 25, 30 years of practice, and I keep learning things every single day. Every time I do a presentation, I have a new story to tell because my children tell me a new part of themselves. They reveal another piece about what it's like to be a child in the child welfare system. And the safer they feel, the more comfortable I feel with the information. Years and years ago, I told the story about one of my children, and some lawyer in the audience came up to me and said, that's very personal information. Do you have permission from your child to share that? I thought, oh, no, I don't. So I went home and I told all of my children that in order to help people do their job better, I needed to tell them about what happens to kids in foster care, and could I do that? And they all but one child said yes. One child said, no, don't ever talk about me. And so for years I did not. Well, he's now 31, and recently we had a long heart-to-heart. And he told me how bad it was for him to be adopted. And he said, I don't want you to take this the wrong way, because I'm so glad you're my mother, but it was really bad, and for years I couldn't let that be known. But now you can tell people about what that means. So I can talk about, I have permission now from all of them. Oops, that was the mic, I'm sorry, Linda. So I'm an adoptive parent, and I'm a social worker, and those are in, kind of juxtaposed order, and that's what you'll be hearing from me today. We decided to do this together because we felt two things. One, that everybody had to have the message, and the other one, and this is the one Jane's already said, I'm going to say it again, is that we all need to be playing by the same rules. What we found was that we had Guardians Ad Litem, and by the way, our CASAs are Guardians Ad Litem in North Carolina. We had Guardians Ad Litem, and they had their set of rules. And we had social workers, and they had their set of rules. And we had parents and parents' attorney, and they had their set of rules. And we were all playing what amounted to a very serious game with the child as the ball. But some of us were playing volleyball, and some of us were playing soccer, and some of us were playing baseball. And the kid was caught in the middle with all these conflicting rules and philosophies and ideas, and they never achieved their goal. Sometimes the attorneys or the social workers would achieve their goals, and most often that was to close the case. But did that child achieve what he or she needed while we were moving toward closing our case? So Jane and I got together about, 20 years ago now, and put together a training session that was much briefer than this. And then as the years have gone on, the folks in the groups that we've presented to, like you, have helped us add to it. So one of the things we'd like to ask you today is tell us, don't do it while the camera's on, but later, tell us where we've gone wrong, what we left out, what you'd like more information on, because we're continuously trying to build our repertoires. We learn more things. We want to pass on more things to the folks we work with. The book that Kathy mentioned that you all have is one that we put together as a compilation of a lot of our training material. But of course we've evolved since then, so we have new stuff to share with you. We hope that you'll find it useful. Again, feel free when you're reading it to write to us with challenges, questions, comments. We'd be thrilled to hear from you. We're working on a second book on termination of parental rights and adoption, and how to make adoption happen, and how to make termination most effective and efficient. But it's slow going. We're slow. We're slow. We'd like to know who you are. Now, we've been told that everyone here is a volunteer. But I know for a fact that's not entirely true, because I know some staff people are here. So if the camera will not be on you. Just tell me, who here is CASA staff? Oh, my gosh. Okay. And do we have any attorneys present? Okay. Social service people. I'm sorry we don't have social service people. Last time we did this presentation in Texas, we had a social worker in the group, bless her heart. I'm going to have to give her a present because we picked on her and used her to balance off some of the things, misbeliefs folks had about social services. So I'll have to be that for us here. I worked for the Division of Social Services for a lot of years. I now work for a private adoption agency. I have the Guardian Ad Litem connection. I have adopted kids. I think I'm qualified to talk today.
Absolutely. Okay. Hold the T-shirt a second.
Yeah.
It's actually called My Head is Full of Children. And Jane found this T-shirt. And it's somebody whose head is literally popping with children. One of the things that we did, and one of the reasons our book is called The Myth of Best Interest, is because I think most of us get into this work thinking we want to do what's best for children. We want to rescue children. We want to improve children's lives. And all that's well and good, but intentions don't get you very far. You've got to turn them into actions, and you can't turn them into actions if all you're talking about are those kind of vague generalities. In fact, you'll hear say all day that, you know what, really, you're not talking about what's best for children. I hate to tell you that, but you know what's best for children? That you never heard of them, that the system never heard of them, that they were never abused or neglected. So when we talk about what's best in the child welfare context, we're really talking about what's next best, what's least worst, what's the least worst thing we can do now that we actually have them in care. And this poem came out in about, 1979, 1980, at the beginning of the permanency planning movement. And it's one of the reasons that we do this, and it's one of the reasons that I hope you're here today. It says, in case you can't read it, we are guilty of many errors and many faults, but our worst crime is abandoning the children, neglecting the fountain of life. Many of the things we need can wait. The child cannot. Right now is the time his bones are being formed, his blood is being made, and his senses are being developed. To him we cannot answer tomorrow. His name is today. And that is by Gabriela Mistral, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And unfortunately, we juxtapose that with another quote. Another reason we're trying to do this today. If the nation had deliberately designed a system that would frustrate the professionals who staff it, anger the public who finance it, and abandon the children who depend on it, it could not have done a better job than the present child welfare system. The first was 1979-80, the second was 1985. 1995.
Yeah.
1995. So the point is, we have our work cut out for us. None of us, Texas, North Carolina, there's not a state in the country that's got it perfect. Some of us are doing better than others. But the fact of the matter is there's a huge need out there. And one of the judges that we worked with in Arkansas, we went to Arkansas and worked with their juvenile court judges, and he said, you know what I need in juvenile court? I need somebody to clear away the clouds for me. I need somebody to clarify and really tell me what's going on and what needs to happen. And I think the CASAs are in the perfect position to do that. Not that everybody else doesn't have that same responsibility, but you are in the perfect sort of a little bit above and over to the side with somewhat less of those turf issues going on. So we think it's very important, and what we want to do is try to give you literal, practical tools and ways in order to do this. So take a look at your first handout. It's the pyramid. I won't tell you the history of the pyramid, except trust me, it started on a flip chart and it looked pretty pitiful. What I did was I started working with the pyramid simply to try to get a visualization of what it takes to build a case. The first thing I want you to notice is that filing a petition is not at the bottom. It's as you move up the scale. So a lot's happened before CASA is ever going to get assigned a case. And we're going to talk about what's happened and what you need to understand about that. It may not be your responsibility to investigate, your responsibility to draw that petition, your responsibility to draft that case plan, but you need to understand them. You need to understand what their purpose is, what they look like, so you can ask intelligent questions about them. So what do I want you to hear about case building to permanence and trying to get to a permanent resolution? And the first thing I want you to hear is it needs to be rational, documented decision making. How many of you have been involved in a case in which you have repeated something that you've already done? That is, you've continued a hearing, you've gone back over ground, something didn't satisfy the judge, you had to start over, or you had to at least take one step back. We don't want to do that. We want to move inexorably forward in our cases. We want to keep our eye on the goal. What did Stephen Covey do? That 7 Habits of Highly Effective People made a fortune writing down things we already knew. One of them is to keep your eye on the goal. What's the goal? The goal is a permanent resolution for this child, a permanent home for this child. It is not to keep him safe from the harm of the abuse or neglect. That is a goal. That is the immediate goal. But the overall goal of the case is, where's this child going to grow up? Where is this child going to grow up? Back with mom and dad? Is it going to be adoption? Is it going to be some sort of placement that's going to be permanent with relatives? Is this going to be one of those children that we consign to long-term foster care? What is the plan for this child? That's what we want to keep our eye on.
Traditional social work, and the way I was trained 122 years ago, basically focused on safety only. We needed to get children away from bad parents, and we did that, and we did it fairly effectively around the removal. This was way before there was any push toward reasonable efforts to prevent placement, and certainly no work toward reunification. Our goal, our job, was to get children in safe places. And a lot of folks still think that way. They think that should be social services' job. That's what the community at large thinks. So one of the things we're going to have to ask you to do is take a deep gulp along with us and recognize that we're not going there at all. Stephen Covey said, start with the end in mind. You cannot start working on a case until you've got the right end in mind, and the right end is permanence. Safety is a piece along the way. Safety and permanence ought to go together, but permanence has to be the overriding goal.
As you read, if you decide to read that chapter in our book, you'll also find that one of the things about case building to permanence is to work on all resolutions at the same time. And I know you've heard of concurrent planning, and we were great. Somebody came up with a good term for that. You know, what we can't do is we can't work a case seriatim. We can't go and you read the petition, and what does it deal with? It deals with mom and abusive boyfriend, okay? You don't even know who daddy is or where daddy is. So you focus for 6-9 months on mom and what she's going to do. And guess what? She's not going to do anything, it turns out. She's going to do that Tammy Wynette. She's not going to put those children's needs first. Children are in the child welfare system because their parents will not put their needs first. One of the biggest things that you need to assess in a parent is, do they reach that point where suddenly they begin to reorient the way they think. And they put their children's basic needs first instead of their need for the man, their need for the drugs, their need for the alcohol, their need for being able to still be 19 and party, whatever their need is. It starts coming second. So the point is, you've spent 6 to 9 months, and now guess what? Reunification isn't going to be the plan. Okay, all right, now we know we really need to start assessing some relatives. And you start looking around, and we'll talk a lot about relatives today, but you determine that in this particular case, the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and the relatives aren't really going to be appropriate. Well, now we know what we need to do now. We're going to terminate parental rights, and we're going to place this child for adoption. And how are you going to terminate parental rights? You're going to have to terminate the parental rights of the father. Oh, yeah, father. Okay, we're going to look for that father. We can't do it that way. That wastes whose time? That wastes the child's time. And the child is not freeze-framed. It's not stuck in the freezer somewhere, not growing, not hurting, not changing, not attaching. We have got to, at all times, be assessing. Who are the dads? Where are the dads? We're going to talk a lot more about this, but that's concurrent planning, and that's what we need to be doing all along. And then finally, we need, as you see, to case build, hopefully 1 year to permanence. That's ASFA language. We'll talk about ASFA. And the other is in the child's sense of time, because we know that we're all beginning to panic about how quickly Christmas is going to come, and a child thinks Christmas is eons away. So things alternatively go very slowly, and yet children change in the blink of an eye. We would be very proud of ourselves if we took a 6-month-old out of the home and in that year had managed to get them into a new permanent home or back with their family. And yet we would start with a 6-month-old, we'd end with an 18-month-old, an entirely different little creature going either to foster parents or adoptive parents or maybe back home to parents who themselves have changed. Everything is changing. We cannot wait. If you don't have a fire in your belly and a sense of urgency about this work, please don't do it. I tell social workers that. You know, it's not a paycheck. If you can't work this thing like a child's life depends on it, then don't do it. Because a child's life does depend on it, not just physically, but emotionally as well. And finally, I always have to tell the Nick joke. Jane has many children. One of them is Nick. He was kind of a smarty teenager, wasn't he, at times? I didn't have any of those, of course. I have a 17-year-old, oh my Lord. At any event, what Nick said one time was, you know, Mom, I can't believe it's time for school to start. You know, when I was young, don't you love it when teenagers say that? When I was young, summer lasted forever, and it just felt great. And now, it's just going by in the blink of an eye. And then he pauses a moment and he says, you know, Mom, if time goes by this fast for me, why, for you, it must go by at the speed of light. But that's
Smart now. Smart now.
But that's what we're talking about. So we want a case build, and we want to get to permanence, and we want to think about that end in mind. And so what are the possible resolutions that we deal with? And we're going to talk about these in detail. Return home to parents, guardianship, custody, whatever, conservatorship, whatever you might call it, to relatives, TPR, which would lead to adoption or perhaps a release for adoption if the parents are willing to do that. And then the resolution that's not at all permanent, but it's on the list because it's a possible outcome, and that is long-term foster care. And I love that euphemism, independent living. Independent living. I don't know about you, but I don't know too many 18-year-olds who thought they needed their parents, and I don't know anybody who made it to 30 without them. So we'll talk a lot about that as well. But you know, we got to start at the beginning. And if you take a look and let your eye drift down to the bottom of that pyramid, you'll see what's at the bottom, and that's values and philosophy. Originally, the pyramid floated in the air. It didn't have any base. And this is something that Kathy told us when they do the training with our book, they spend a lot of time on, and this is because it's really important. You have to park your personal set of values that you brought in here and you are absolutely entitled to at the door. And when you start doing this work, what we're telling you is there's a set of values that you have to have if you're going to do it effectively for children.
And this is really the hardest part, and the hardest part of this presentation. If you can get through this with us, then we'll be on board together. But if you can't, and if we annoy you more than we please you, you're not going to get to hear the rest of the stuff because you're going to hear through a filter of, I don't think they know what they're talking about. I have a daughter-in-law who is also a guardian ad litem. And she's a wonderful young woman, and we're so glad she married John. So that can even be on tape. But we've had a discussion recently that was very discouraging to me. She asked when Jane and I gave her the book early on, and then she asked when we were going to be doing this presentation again. I told her she could come to Texas. That was a little bit outside of her travel budget. But she said, I'm really having trouble with this. She is now working at social services. And she said, I'm having trouble not taking kids when their parents are so sorry. I have one child in my caseload where his head is crawling with lice and the mother hasn't cleaned it up, and the social worker, she's doing income maintenance, the social worker said to her, well, at least she's trying to pick the lice out. And he was actually being sarcastic. I know the social worker. But he also had a point, and he suggested she talk to her mother-in-law about it. From her perspective, that child should be out of the home. From my perspective and from the social worker's perspective, someone I had trained, there are worse things than lice crawling all over your head. And that's basically where we're coming to you from. When I first saw this T-shirt that said, my head is full of children, I didn't buy it. The first year I was at National Casa, I didn't buy it. Because I thought, well, it's not my head that's full of children, it's my heart. You know, that's what it should say. My heart is full of children. And then I started to think about it. It really kind of preyed on my mind for a whole year. And I thought, wait a minute, it really has to be in my head. Because if it's just my heart, I'm going to do foolish things. I'm going to take kids I can't parent. I'm going to rescue kids that don't need rescuing. I'm going to return kids that ought to be kept in care. I'm going to place them with the wrong kind of adoptive families. I need to keep these kids in my head. And that's why this presentation is called My Head is Full of Children, because we want you to put a lot of the stuff that's already in your heart, and we want you to put it through a filter in your head. And this filter, as I said earlier, takes a gulp to come along with us. Because the very first thing, we gave you a core values in Child Welfare Services sheet. And this is actually the condensed version. We have a much longer version that's in the book. But this condensed version is our talking points. Don't you love that guy who has the talking points? I want that. I want some little thing to flip up my talking points. This is our talking points. And the most important points are covered here. And let me just take you through them very quickly so that you can put all this in your head and let this be your filter. Every child has the right to a safe, permanent home. We've already said that. I think we all agreed. I saw some nods. Okay, the second part of that sentence is where we kind of fall down. At a minimum level of care. Now, what does that mean? Whoa, well, that means that there are all kinds of lousy things that parents do with and to their children that are not our business. And that's a big gulp. That's a big gulp. Lice in your head is not necessarily the business of social services. So, that's the biggest gulp. The next one, which is another big gulp, is that there's a range of parenting styles and practices that is acceptable. Now, we're not saying that is good, or we like them, or we approve of them, but it's acceptable if minimal care is provided. So, okay, the next logical question is, well, what is minimal care? Well, minimal care is a wavy line. It's kind of wavy line.
It's wavy.
Because it's not a bright line, it's not an easy thing to define, because it depends upon the child in question. It depends upon the situation. What's minimal for a 6-month-old is quite different than what's minimal for a 6-year-old or a 12-year-old. I can leave my 12-year-old alone for a couple of hours at a time, and nobody would even think I was not an adequate parent. But what if I left my 6-month-old or even 6-year-old alone for hours at a time? So parental behavior has to be tied with the effect on the child. That's another one of the principles we have to really make sure you have clearly. Parental behavior alone is not our issue. And today, at one point, we may actually go down the dangerous and rocky road of substance abuse, because people can do substances and abuse them, and we still shouldn't be involved with their children. Because parental behavior alone is not the issue. The equation is the issue. What is the effect on the child? So minimum care is kind of mushing. Well, Jane and I both told you that we're adoptive parents. And I adopted my first set of kids 23 years ago. Oh, my God, that makes me very old. Back then, they did a home study. They actually came in and, evaluated you. Now they call it MAP, most places, or some kind of joint decision-making, let me tell you what, just as an aside, it's all an assessment. We're still evaluating people. And what happens when you finish the assessment, and one of my jobs for the adoption agency with whom I work is to look at the assessments and to question when things are left out and to probe a little bit harder. But the copy we send out for publication is sanitized often. We want to present our parents in the best possible light. We also present the material back to the parents. And in the old days, they didn't do that. They wrote an assessment of you, and they wrote you up, and you either were approved or not. Okay?
It was all super secret.
It was super secret. But I've been nosy. I told you that early on. I've been nosy my whole life. So while the social worker, bless her heart, was working on this, I said, I really want to read that at the end. I want to see what that says. And she was, okay, I guess that's okay. So she finished. And she brought the assessment home study to our house. And then I decided I didn't want to read it. It was kind of like, there are mornings I don't want to get on the scale either. So I said, I'm going to pass. But Lee is a much braver soul than I, and also is thin. He doesn't know the scale analogy. He said, let me read it. And he sat there reading it. And while he was reading, he was chuckling a lot. And I said, when he finished, what was so funny? And he said, well, I'll tell you what. I want to be adopted by this family. He didn't recognize us because this worker was so impressed with our articulation, our presentation, that we were ideal. And there was nothing about us that was even the slightest bit concerning to anyone. In fact, I have to tell you, we did not rehearse our children. We had birth children. But she asked, what's the worst thing about your parents? And our older son said, they always agree and support each other. I hate that we can't. Right thing to say, boy. But honestly, we didn't rehearse them. So we were ideal. But, the fact of the matter is that I had this consulting job, and I was gone a lot of days. And I'd get home at the end of a long week, and I'd be tired, and the kids would be arguing, and their chores wouldn't be done. And most of the time I was able to come in and say, we're going to have a family meeting about this, but you have really annoyed me. And that was pretty good parenting, I thought. I was pretty proud of that. And then there'd be days I'd come in and I'd say, what the hell is going on here? Without blaming anyone. So that was like good parent, okay? I wasn't blaming any of the kids. And then there were days when I'd come in and I'd say, I'm going to kill somebody if this doesn't stop. Okay?
She's dropping like a rock, isn't she?
That was kind of okay parenting because I didn't kill anybody, okay? Now, had I gone to the next step, and the reason I never had to go to the next step is, thank God, Lee is much more level-headed than I, and he'd come and say, okay, Jane, you come over here, I'll take care of this. But if I had hit somebody, which I did not do, but if I had, well, social service wouldn't be involved. That would be, okay, maybe I would have popped somebody who needed popping, as my grandmother used to say. That might have been fair parenting. And if I popped somebody who didn't need popping, that might have been poor parenting, okay? But all of those behaviors I've described to you are things that go on in everyone's home every single day. There are parents who cuss and yell and scream and slap their kids and throw things, and we don't know anything about them. It's not our business. And if we were in that home, we might not like it. In fact, I had an acquaintance whose children were the same age as my older children. And finally, my kids got to the point where they said, we don't want to go to her house anymore because she is so mean to her kids. And she was. She was mean to her kids. Well, that was, 30 years ago. Her kids are just fine. No social worker ever intervened. She was mean. And her house was so nasty, too. That was what drove me crazy. I'm a little OCD. But you can see that there is what we call a range of parenting styles there. And I know that if we gave you enough time to really dwell on it, you could come up with your own examples. And you can see that wavy line.
It kind of scoots up through most of awful, kind of grabs a little bit of crappy, because you know what, depending on the child, crappy may well not get it. Doesn't really touch lousy, because below that wavy line is inadequate, dangerous. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about minimum sufficient level of care.
And I can tell you that lousy and crappy is something I see all the time. In fact, I have a terrible story I will not tell you now, but a little child in a grocery store was being slapped by her parent for what I felt was no reason at all. And I was going to go and say something, but I was truly frightened of that parent, because if she could slap the child, she'd probably slap me. So my goal is to live long enough to be very, very old and harmless looking, and then to go up and correct parents.
And wear purple.
And wear purple, right. My point is that that lousy and crappy goes on every day as well. I mean, the other ones, the yelling and being mean somewhat, you know, we all know about that. We've probably all done it ourselves. Lousy and crappy, we haven't done, but we know people who do. We see people in Walmart. We even talked about Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas, so we'll talk about it here. You go to Walmart late at night, and there's a kid in the buggy, and their nose is running, and they're whining, and they should be home in bed, and they're having a little fit, and the parent slaps them and hands them a candy bar, which they probably won't pay for later, which really annoys me. That's crappy parenting. But you know, I see that, and I still don't call social services. I still don't call social services. So what we're saying to you is the big gulp is that you have to agree that we should not be involved when it gets at least too lousy. Now that's tough. But the fact of the matter is, as a CASA, you don't know about those cases that are lousy because you never heard about them because they're not reported to social services. Your neighbor might be a lousy parent, and your son-in-law probably is. Oh no, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that to my son-in-law, but you know what I'm saying? We know people, we can judge them, but we don't take any legal action toward them. What happens in our cases is that we focus on, we've done a good job in our system of focusing on parental behavior that causes harm to children. Talked to you about that equation already. That's when the case is referred to social services. That's when they investigate. That's when they find that the child's been abused and neglected. But let me give you some quick national figures. Of every 100 cases reported to social services where someone in the community thinks the parents have been below crappy to awful or dangerous or inadequate, of 100 cases reported, only 60 are actually investigated. Why are the other 40 not investigated? Because they do not meet the definition of abuse and neglect. In almost every state in this nation, you have to have at least met the definition of abuse and neglect. So I could call in and I can say, you know, they're partying over there all night long. And that case will not be investigated in North Carolina because someone, hopefully, will be smart enough to say, well, what happens to the kids? Oh, well, she pawns them off on other people. Okay, that's positive. The kids are not there to be affected. So we're not going to investigate. So 100 are reported, 60 are investigated. Of the 60 that are investigated, 20 are found to be in need of services or that the children have been abused or neglected. 20. 1/3 of the 60. Okay, what happens then? We have those 20. We have all agreed that of these 100 cases, 20 of them, the kids are treated badly enough that it's a problem. Well, in the majority of cases, about 16 to 18, depending upon the jurisdiction, the family works cooperatively with social services and no petition is ever filed. That leaves us 4 out of the original 100 that you're involved in. So you know you're seeing the worst of the worst. You're seeing the ones where they found the parents to be abusive or neglectful, they would not cooperate or could not cooperate for whatever circumstantial reason around treatment before the petition, and then a petition was filed. They came into court, and you're appointed to the case. You're involved in the case. So you have the cases that are pretty far below minimally adequate level of care. Somebody, the judge, the court, social services has already decided that, defined that, and provided enough evidence to the court to convince the judge at least to hold the child to a hearing on the merits.
You know, one of the things I think we have to keep in mind is that this is not Jane and Jane's idea of a parenting scale. This is not Jane and Jane's idea of when social services needs to get involved. The court system has said, and I hope it's good news to you because most of you are in families and many of you have children, is that your right to family integrity, your right to take care of your own children as you believe is appropriate, is an absolute, guaranteed constitutional right. So just imagine for a moment that you're 19 and you're doing the best you can, but your mother doesn't like it. And she thinks she can do better. And you know what? She probably could. She's older, wiser, more mature, more stable, better job, and she wants custody of your child. So do you think at that point it should just be what's best for the child? It kind of gives Grandma a leg up, doesn't it? What do you want? What do you want the standard to be? If you were hauled into court and somebody wanted to remove your children, you'd want the standard to be that you're unfit underneath the line. And that's what the standard is. The Supreme Court of the United States said one time in a case, even if it were shown, for example, that a particular couple desirous of adopting a child would best provide for the child's welfare, the child would nonetheless not be removed from the custody of its parents so long as they were providing for the child adequately. Now, we'll argue about adequately all day long, and that's what we need to argue about. That's the issue. But it's not up there. It's down here. And that is a way of protecting that constitutional right. So when we talk about fair or poor or lousy or crappy, what you're talking about are folks that you don't want to raise your children, but they have a right to raise their children. And that's different.
The next two things on this list of core values are ones we can pretty much probably agree about without any big gulps or having to go over the big hump of belief here. And we have to remove risk from children, not children from risk. I told you when I first started in the profession, we removed children from risk because we thought that there were no consequences to that. And we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the consequences of removal. So we can shelve that one. If you don't quite agree with it, just shelve it, and we'll prove that to you without any problem. Parents have the right to decide not to change. Now, let me tell you about why this is important to consider, because we're going to sound schizophrenic to you, and I want you to know we're not, because we're going to talk to you a lot right here and for the next, hour or so about not removing kids precipitously, about returning kids quickly, about respecting parental rights and not judging parental behavior. We're going to talk a lot about that. And at the same time, concurrently, we're going to talk to you about preparing a case for termination of parental rights. Because here's our bottom line philosophy. I want to give the parents a chance because I believe in my heart that every child would grow up better with their own people. Less than 5% of the children in our country are adopted. My children are different from every other child they associate with. It's a very huge burden. My oldest son is 38 years old. He still is carrying that burden. My others are carrying it equally. So I want you to think about, we don't want children to be adopted, but if their parents will not or cannot do it, we're going to cut them off. We're not going to waste the child's life. The longer we take with this child in care, the more likely he is to be damaged by the system. So parents have the right to decide not to change, but the consequences are they lose their kids. So on the one hand, we're going to talk to you very vehemently about preserving families and returning kids. And at the same time, what I want you to hear, underscoring all of that, is, but if the parents can't and won't do it, we have to move forward quickly. And here's the good news, the very good news. If you've prepared your case correctly, if you have worked hard to advocate that the parents get a chance, and they have shown that they can't do it, then you can sleep at night. When my son said to me, I don't know that they gave my dad a chance, and I was able to pull out for him all the chances they gave him, because by the way, I was the consultant for the agency, and I made them give him every chance. When I was able to show that to him, not only was he able to settle into that understanding, but I knew that I had not stolen him from some poor, pitiful fellow who just needed a little more help. So that's what we're talking about here. If the parents won't change, we're going to move forward. Here is one of the hardest hoops, and the one you have got to make sure social services sticks to. We have to have the same standards for intervention that we have for return, and we have to keep the same standards throughout the life of the case. Now here's what happens in real life. We have pretty much mastered not taking kids away unless the parents fall below a minimal level of care. We've got that down. We're doing well in this country over that. Here's where we fall apart. We want the parents to be better parents when we return their kids. Well, you might say, well, duh, Jane, of course we want them to be better. The problem is how much better we want them to be. We don't want them to just be lousy. We won't settle for lousy. We want them to be good parents. So what we do is we raise the bar. And you know what? Most of us couldn't get over that bar if we were being judged on every single thing we did. Most of us would fall short somewhere. And when we raised the bar on parent, we took their children. Here's a typical case. We got these kids because mom was arrested for bad checks. She's in jail, and she's had a falling out with her mother, and she has no resource system, and we take the kids because they literally have no place else to go. We can say she's neglected them because she committed a crime, did a stupid thing, failed to make adequate plans for them. She's out of jail. Do we give them back? Well, I think we should give them back. We only took them because she went to jail. We were able to make a legal case, but that doesn't mean that she was day-to-day care neglecting them. We should give them back, and we should help her not to commit a crime again and to make sure she has adequate plans in case she does go to jail. Instead, we hold them long enough so that she loses her public assistance benefits, so she's lost her housing. She didn't have a job in the first place, or she had a minimal job, and now she's lost that as well, because when she went to jail, they cut her off. And so now we have kids who are stuck in foster care. If we had given the kids back very quickly after she got out of jail, and I don't know how your jails work, but in North Carolina, 24 hours, you're in and you're out, we might have been able to keep that family together. Now, did we do those children any favor by keeping them? Probably not. Because by the time we can get around to a termination of parental rights hearing in that case, we're 2 years down the road. And those kids have been in 3 placements, and they've lost their mother and several foster parents and their siblings, and we're going to get to that in a little while. But I have to tell you, we have to keep the same standards. And this is where you can really be the gatekeeper. We have to say, would we have removed those children today? And you have to do that every single day you're evaluating that case. Once the children have come into care, the standard for your evaluation should be, would we have removed them today? Are there circumstances that would have caused us to remove them today? And I'm not talking about circumstances that we created by our intervention. I'm talking about circumstances around the parental behavior that would cause harm to the children.
So
Would
when
we
you
remove them today?
When you get involved and you're concerned about housing, it's not that we don't want to help a mother achieve better housing, but the children came in because they were not being appropriately supervised. You now believe, through the help of parenting skills or classes or whatever, she understands what it takes to supervise a 3-year-old child. Then what does housing have to do with it? Did we remove the child because of the housing? No. So why should that be a barrier to giving the child back? What you have to continually ask yourself, where's the case plan targeted? Why did we remove that child? And if those have been ameliorated, then why are we keeping the child in care? Because you know what? When you delay because you wanted to get up there a ways and you're not too sure about that boyfriend, we didn't remove because of the boyfriend. You'd like her to have better housing, we didn't remove because of the housing. You'd like her to have a better job, job had nothing to do with why we removed the children. Then you are setting these children up to remain in limbo, and you're setting this mother up to fail for no good reason. There are plenty of cases you're going to have where mom is not going to respond, not going to accept responsibility for what she's done, not put the needs of the child first. I understand, because we are taking so few cases to court, and those are the cases you see, you're not going to have a lot of successes in terms of reunification. But you need to always be open to the parent that is trying to improve and get back up there. And I will tell you, and Jane will say the same thing, you know, they found me to be ideal too, I guess. I never did read my home study. But what I will tell you is that when they came to do the home study, I was cleaning underneath the cabinets in the bathroom. When they came later to do that post-placement report after my first daughter, Ann Elizabeth, had been placed with me for maybe a month, and the social worker came, I was terrified when she came at feeding time, because I was afraid Ann Elizabeth wasn't going to burp. And she was going to have stomach pains, and she was going to cry. And that worker was going to sit there and judge me as a bad parent. I'm an attorney. I'm an educated person. I was raised well. I had a lot of, I hope, skills about parenting. And yet that power differential was still in my face. Now, you imagine what it feels like when you and the social worker go visiting in some of these homes. So we need to set these parents up to succeed in doing what they want to do, or what they say they want to do, which is get the children back. So that, as Jane said, the children get to grow up in their own home if at all possible, and we sleep at night because we know we've done everything we can. It's just how long is that going to be and what does it going to look like? And we'll talk about that a lot more as we go along.
Permanence is achieved only when the child has a legal relationship with an attachment figure. We're going to talk about that more in a few minutes and what that really means and what that really looks like for kids. But I have to tell you that very quickly. Remember, Jane put up the possible outcomes there, and long-term foster care was down the bottom. We're going to pretty quickly eliminate that one. That's one of our strong values. That is not going to work in our lives. But here's the bottom line, that we have a challenge to balance all of these things. That's where the schizophrenia, kind of disappears, and you get to see that maybe we make some sense. But that's you right there in the middle. This is our best attempt. And some of our later material, this is done better, and Jamie have to pop out a new overhead. But that's our best attempt there to show you what it means to have to balance things out. That you are the juggler, and you have to make sure that you're keeping your eyes on family preservation, on child protection, and on permanence all at the same time. You can't pick one over the other, because if you do, that child is going to be damaged.
Nobody said this was easy. Nobody said this was easy. In fact, Jane and I did this training in a very truncated way, and within weeks, Jane got a call saying, "You've messed this up. You got to come fix your mess." And she says, "What are you talking about?" A judge was in the audience, and all she heard was, "Children shouldn't leave their families. I'm not going to terminate rights anymore." Is that what we just said? No, but that's what she picked up on. That's the ball she wanted to run with. You can't do that, folks. You can't pick just one ball. You've got to juggle all of them, and look where you're standing. You're on a teeter-totter. The needs of the child, this child has a lot of special needs and needs a lot of assistance and the system issues, but you know what? The only foster home they've got is not really adequate to meet that child's needs right now. They're hoping to move them soon. Oh, good, let's give them another move. Or they have to put them in group care, or they can't start therapy right away because of there's not enough money, or there are not enough psychologists out there to immediately get this child into therapy. So you've got the needs of the child sometimes at odds with what the system can provide. And then you're balancing on that triangle that says community standards and values, because you know what? They don't want children to have lice in their hair. I mean, that's awful. Somebody needs to do something about that. And so you are in really a way of translating for the community what the social services system is supposed to be about, that is here, and what the community wants it to be about, which is sort of about here. Let's rescue everybody. And this is, as we said, this is the first step. It's sometimes the hardest step. I will also tell you that I hope by the end of this 4 hours, when the rest of the information comes out, you will see that this is a seamless whole, and you can't just pick one part and feel like, okay, I have to feel perfect about this. If you feel uneasy, that's okay. Live with the discomfort a little bit, because there's a whole lot more to come.
We do juvenile court judges training, as Kathy said earlier. And one of the things we always start off telling the judges is that we're not coming to them with answers. We're coming to them to raise their consciousness and to make them somewhat uncomfortable. Because if you sit there behind a case and you think you know what to do every single time, I wish you'd email me very quickly, because I don't know what to do after all these years. I don't understand what makes people work. I don't understand why some parents change and others don't. But I have a lot of cues and clues, and that's what I am hoping to give you today and have you gather as well. My point is that you should be uncomfortable. You should be starting to squirm a little bit and say, this is harder than I thought it might be, because it really is. Anyone who thinks this is easy should not be in this business. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. If you don't have a fire in your belly, you have to really have a fire in your belly to do this work. You have to feel it as a calling and a mission, because if it were anything less, you would be shortchanging not only yourself, but the children you represent.
Take a look at this. Judicial process must exist in the removal of children. Now, what does that tell us prior to 1980? Social worker said something to the judge, kids are out of there, that's the end of that. No judicial process. And we must demonstrate that judicial orders were followed, including judicial authority to order specific placements. So starting in 1980, which, folks, is not that long ago, all of a sudden, all of these issues about rights came to the forefront, and we began to do child welfare in a very different way. A written case plan within 60 days of custody or placement. That's where this comes from. Does Texas do it in less time? We do it in 30 in North Carolina. When is a case plan required to be done? You need to know that, all right? Placement must be in the least restrictive, most family-like setting. Demonstration of services provided related to removal of the child and the parent's response. That's all about case plans. We'll talk about those. Written visitation agreement, advance notice if the child is moved, internal agency reviews every 6 months. And then I love this one. In 1980, when we decided that we had to strengthen the due process part of child welfare services, we thought it was fine. In fact, we thought it was cutting edge to require court reviews at least 18 months after placement. Can you imagine if you could wait and not lose any federal funding? 18 months after adjudication would be soon enough to have a review, and yearly thereafter. And then it also allowed voluntary placement agreements that needed to be reviewed in 180 days. So this has been around since 1980. It is what the Fed said. Every state has to have this plan, and if you don't have this plan, you get no federal money, and federal money runs the child welfare system in this country. So every state has this, okay? In some way or another, every state has this. What happened? Two things happened. Reasonable efforts got bogged down. People began to say, yes, we do need to make reasonable efforts. We can't just snatch children away and never return them. We've got to do something. That's right. And that is right. Except sometimes, you know how that pendulum swings? And it swings way over here and right past where it would be reasonable. We went from no services to mom and dad, as Jane says, she basically kidnapped children when she first started, all the way over to, oh, we're going to work. We're going to work forever, against all odds, no matter how long it takes. We're going to try to reunify. And what happened to the children in the meantime? They got stuck. They got stuck in care, stuck moving, and all of a sudden we realized, whoa, wait a minute, something needs to change about reasonable efforts. And the other thing that happened is that 18 months was simply way, 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 way too slow in order to do what we wanted to do. So ASFA came along, the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997, which President Clinton signed into law. And it addressed those two issues, whereas PL 96-272 said we are going to make reasonable efforts. Those were refined by ASFA to clarify, first of all, health and safety are the first concern. So what ASFA said is health and safety are the first concern. If those are compromised, there is no reunification. We can consider reasonable efforts, and guess what? Not pursue it in some cases. There will be some cases so egregious that the answer is we're not doing reasonable efforts. And if we do them, they must be made concurrently with other plans, such as termination of parental rights grounds, placement with relatives, etc. And those 18 months, that's not going to get it either. And so ASFA says permanency planning hearing within 12 months of the entry into foster care. If you decide early on that reasonable efforts, you decide a month or two into the case that reasonable efforts aren't going to happen, then you immediately have to have a permanency planning hearing within 30 days. You can't wait to the end of the 12 months. And then we've got to file termination petitions if the child's been in foster care 15 out of the last 22 months. In North Carolina, we've changed that to 12, unless there's a compelling reason or the child is in a relative's care, which I certainly hope is going to be a permanent plan, but we'll talk more about relatives. So the idea is, yes, we're going to give parents a chance, but never if it compromises the child's health or safety, and we are going to move a lot quicker to make and to find that permanent resolution. So the feds, for all of what we complain about them, actually have been promulgating some pretty good social work out there. And again, that is why you will see that across the country, juvenile codes look a whole lot more alike now than they look different by virtue of these federal laws. If you'll take a look at your next handout, What Children Need, this is another piece of the puzzle that we're trying to put together for you. You know, Jane and I have talked about values and what the kind of values that you need, not your personal values. You know, I don't think children's ears should be pierced when they're too young to take care of them themselves, i.e. as babies, but that's clearly not a value I try to foist on other people. So we've talked about values and how the values need to work in this system. And we've talked about the legal piece and what the law requires and how it has changed. And yet, you know, years ago when Jane and I started doing this training, I kind of said to her, okay, I got that, but is there something else? You know, how do I still know what children need and how that meshes with the position they find themselves in the system? And so she created this next handout on what children need, and I want you to take a look at it with me. All children need. You, me, when we were children, our children, the children in this system, every child in the world needs 4 things. They need care, and they need stimulation, and they need continuity, and they need reciprocity. Now think with me. I mean, nobody's arguing about that. I mean, that's basic psychology 101. And you see what they are. Continuity is that assurance that care and stimulation will be provided by the same people over time, that those people will be there for you. And only when those people are there with you over time do you develop a reciprocal relationship with them. I don't have a reciprocal relationship with you in that sense because I don't know you that well. We have not had that over time experience. But that is what reciprocity is, what makes us human, the give and take of love in a human relationship. So think about it for a minute. You're a social worker or you're a CASA and you're evaluating your case that's just hit your desk. And what do? We know what care and stimulation should look like. We know what children at a certain age need in terms of care and stimulation. We assess it, we value it, and we find, because they're in care now, that it fell below minimally adequate. And you know what else we know? We feel pretty comfortable at night that when those children came into care, they have been placed somewhere that can replicate, that can give them good care and stimulation. And how many of you have had cases where foster parents have literally turned children's lives around? I've got them. Children who came in delayed and damaged, and they got exactly what they needed. They got care and they got stimulation, and those folks were there for them, and it was, you know, I had one little fella, and I don't know where his genes came from, because his parents didn't give him any that were worth much. They were very limited, and they loved him a lot, but they couldn't care for him. And he ended up in May, before kindergarten, being assessed and needing every kindergarten extra special service you could get come fall. He went into care in July, and in September he needed none of those special services. That was because he'd been in a placement that provided him appropriate care and stimulation. Okay? What about continuity and reciprocity? Look down a little bit. Care and stimulation equal nurturing. You are really good at thinking about nurturing, assessing nurturing, and valuing nurturing. But what do continuity and reciprocity equal? They equal commitment. Do you even think about continuity and reciprocity when you're looking at a case? How many social workers do you think that go out and value and assess and find as a strength in this family, even though the care is down here, that these folks have been there for each other, that there's a reciprocal, loving, committed relationship between these children and their parents. And the fact that the care and stimulation is down here does not mean that there is not attachment. And that's one of the things Jane will talk about a lot tomorrow in her session. In fact, sometimes you can have even stronger attachment when your needs aren't met on as perfect a basis, because you get such a strong need for something and then finally it's met and it's like, oh, thank goodness, and you attach even more strongly to someone who frankly would be viewed as inadequate by you and I. So there's commitment. That child feels a commitment. Does the child want to be beaten? No. Does the child want to lose his family? No. How many of you can list in your mind things you wish your mom and dad had not done to you? From the fairly insignificant that just annoyed the fool out of you, to maybe something more significant. Did you want to lose your family over those failings on the part of your parents? So what we've got is we've got continuity and reciprocity that we don't value, we don't think about, we don't assess, and you know what? We can't replicate in the foster care system. In fact, even if you give me an example of children who have come in and stayed in the same foster home, that still is not an example of continuity and reciprocity. Why? First of all, my guess is that they've seen kids leave. It doesn't take long for children to figure out what being a foster child means. And as Jane will tell you, we've been told by more than one foster child of many ages, including adults, that there is nothing in the world worse than being a foster child.
I was attending regularly permanency planning review meetings at a particular agency that I was the consultant for, and I just happened to be there when the same case was heard over a year and a half. It was basically coincidence because I didn't plan it that way, but I guess it was fortuitous coincidence because there was a lesson there for me and hopefully a positive outcome for a child. We started in discussing this case. These were two little African-American boys in a foster home with a foster mom who was dedicated to them, absolutely committed to adopting them. Their mother had abandoned them. She had been gone forever. And she had eventually been located and signed relinquishments. So they were kind of semi-free for adoption, but there was a dad. Actually, there were two dads. And we had our first permanency planning hearing shortly after the first permanency planning review, internal review, shortly after the mother relinquished, and we told the foster mother this great news, that these two boys were going to get to be her children. We just had to get around to terminating on the daddies. But, you know, she just held on. That wasn't the highest priority because we wanted to get into court on some of the ones where moms hadn't relinquished, and we really needed to get those kids free, and we didn't know what was going to happen until the judge spoke. So she took that news very well. In fact, she was pretty happy about the mother's relinquishment, and 6 months passed, and we had another internal permanency planning hearing, and we talked about it some more, and we said, you know, we promise we're going to get to you boys in a little while. It's just that, you know, there are other cases, and we're a small agency, we have a limited budget, but, you know, and she took that pretty well, and kind of said, okay, I'll tell the boys it's not time yet. The next time we had the same story for her, and now we're, you know, a year from that first hearing, and 2.5 years since she got these kids. She had them a year and a half before the mother relinquished. And we told her the same thing. You know, small agency, small budget, attorneys busy, you know, we'll get to it. But, you know, they're going to be there. They're going to be there with you forever, and that it's permanent. And in our heads, we had all marked that achieve the permanent goal. In fact, on our forms for the state, there's a little place where you can check, even if you haven't done your legal work, that they're in their permanent placement, kind of a fictive permanence here. So we took a break after that particular case, and we all walked outside, and this mom literally grabbed me by the collar, and she said, Miss Jane, you got to do something. I'm like, what? What's wrong? She said, y'all are killing my boys. And I said, you know, Miss Jones, I don't understand. And she said, every time I come to one of these meetings, they're scared that they're going to be moved. Every time that social worker steps foot in my house, they're sure they're going to leave. Every time there's a court hearing, they're waiting for the judge to pronounce a sentence on them as if it were the death sentence. You're killing them. If we don't have this adoption soon, I don't know that I can keep them, because they're so upset every time that I feel overwhelmed. Guess what? We had the termination right away then. They were adopted. End of that story. But that story really was so profound to me because I thought about all of the kids that we think are in their permanent placements, where we've dropped our shoulders and said, okay, it's long-term foster care, but it's special long-term foster care because they have an attachment figure. And so we can drop our we can't drop our shoulders. Kids need the legal security. My children, every single one of them, wanted to see those adoption papers. Even the ones that didn't like me by the time the papers came. They wanted to see those adoption papers. They wanted to know that now there was nothing they could do to get them kicked out. So.
And I think there's another way to illustrate this, and I always pick Emily. Emily is one of Jane's many grandchildren. I'm always scared to ask how many there are out there these days.
It changes every day.
Exactly. It's hard to keep up. But Emily is the child of Jane's biological daughter, who's also a social worker. And she did it the Dr. Laura way, and that is she went and got college and worked and then got married and had a dog, a house, and had children. And what that means is, I know, and now that I have girls who are 17 and 23, it makes a lot of sense to me. I kind of like that plan. All right. So what is Emily? Emily was wanted, and Emily was anticipated, and Emily is surrounded. She's tucked in a cocoon with 3 rings around her, and this is definitely in the book as well. And the first ring is the ring of her biological parents, because that's what they are. And the next one is the ring of her legal parents. That's what they are. And the next one is the ring of her parenting parents. So Kim and Ronnie are parenting Emily. They're her legal parent. and they're her biological parents. She can't be safer, rocking in the cradle, in the middle of all these nice, strong rings. And that's what we mean when we talk about she's getting care and and stimulation and continuity and reciprocity. And this is what we would love for all children, and to never have these rings broken apart. But what happens? The kids come into care, and all of a sudden, the child isn't even in the center of this piece of paper anymore. We're going to pick Nick, who is one of Jane's children, who was adopted when he was 9. Nick has now come into the foster care system. Where is the legal ring? The legal ring is down here. That's DSS. Where's the biological ring? It's down here. That's Mom. Actually, in Nick's case, Dad. So what ring is around Nick? Just the parenting ring, which would mean foster parents in his case. That's the only ring he's got around it. What if, instead of being in a family foster home, Nick was in some sort of group care? Then I would have to put holes in that ring. You know, we talk a lot about group care, and I know that it's necessary. I guess it's necessary. I know there's some children that have difficulty living in families, but you know what? What we have is today's house parents and tomorrow's house parents and the weekend respite parents. And you turn 10 and you get to go to a new cottage. Isn't that what you wanted when you were 10? A new set of permanent caregivers in your life. And you're separated from your siblings. And it is a very difficult way to grow up. Jane and I heard from a judge one time about a study of group care providers, and I don't know how many of you may be Catholics, but the Catholics kind of, you know, rose to the top in terms of the outcome measures, as they call it, for children. And when you thought about it, though, it made perfect sense. When that young child went in to the group home or to the orphanage, Sister Mary Margaret was there to comfort her. And it was time to learn to ride a bike at age 5, Sister Mary Margaret taught her. And when somebody needed to go to school, meet with the teachers, and go to PTA, that was Sister Mary Margaret. And when someone needed to pick out a prom dress, that was Sister Mary Margaret. And when you needed somebody there when you graduated from high school, there was Sister Mary Margaret. Because she was married to the church, and she was married to her work. And so she was there over time. That placement provided the best hope for that child of continuity and reciprocity. Most group care is, of course, not that way. So what is our goal? Our goal is to get all 3 of these rings back together. That's called reunification. Now they've been split apart. So they're not quite as strong, and they've got to be put back together. And services to families, when you're reunifying children with them, is some of the most daunting services you can provide, because you are returning different children to different people, at least in a degree. What if that is not possible, we want to do is have the parenting ring and the legal ring together. Whoever is parenting the child have legal rights to that child. Now, this came up in a case that Jane and I did in one of the counties. Early on in my career, I tried a lot of cases. I tried a number of termination of parental rights cases. I think they only called on me when they knew they were going to be appealed. And there was a case that involved a very pitiful mom. She was schizophrenic. She had her illness, which is, schizophrenia is a very scary illness. You're a perfectly normal functioning adult, and then you're not. And it came on after the birth of her first child, whose name is Paul. And therefore, Paul had sort of picked up the brunt of this, but it got worse after the birth of Amy. So at this point in time, they had been working with her, and we can talk more about how they worked with her when we talk about case plans and visits. But the bottom line was it was time to terminate parental rights. And it was, the attorney was on maternity leave, lucky me. So I was there, and Jane was going to be one of my witnesses. And I walk in, and what do I find? I find that the guardian ad litem, the CASA, opposed termination of parental rights. And the attorney for the mother opposed termination of parental rights. And she had her own guardian ad litem because she was disabled, and that person opposed termination of parental rights. And to make my life even more joyous that day, the judge had a plan to avoid termination of parental rights altogether, because most judges would rather do almost anything than hear a termination of parental rights case. They take a long time. It's sort of the civil equivalent of the death penalty. It's very emotional. It's very difficult to do. especially if they're not going to be well presented and well organized. The judge would just almost rather do anything than be there. So he called us all back into chambers, and he said, I have a plan. I know that these foster parents are committed to these children. By the way, Paul was 14 at that point in time, and Amy was 8. And he says, you know, Ms. Thompson, they're getting kind of old. And the foster parents are committed to them. And I know that right now, the mom can't care for them. I mean, everybody's pretty much in agreement. The issue was looking ahead to the future, okay? And he said, so why not, let's just give custody to the foster parents. After all, they're the parenting parents, and you're going to give them a legal ring called custody. And then, if mom ever gets better, you know, if there's some medication that works, we'll have another hearing, and maybe, you know, the children can go back to her. But for right now, I just think this is the best plan. Well, I didn't agree to that, and I guess thankfully for me, the other side didn't agree to it either, so I wasn't the only one irritating the judge. But this was an irritated judge, which is never a good way to start a court case. And what I had to show the judge was why these children needed something even more permanent as their legal ring, and what would happen to them if they didn't get it. And so what I asked and put that burden was on Jane to share that information with the judge.
A couple of things you need to know. I'm going to stand too so that people can see me.
You're short.
I'm short, yeah. I'm short to begin with. A couple of things you need to know. One was that before I testify in any case, I always talk to the children. One time I didn't, and that petard was not a good one to be hoisted on. Although my testimony is not about particular children, it's about what children in general need. One of the things I know the judge wants to know was that I put them in that category, that I knew that they were like the other children I'd worked with. So I talked to both Paul and Amy, and Paul was very, very depressed over this. He yearned to be free of the burden of caring for his mother, because even though he'd been in foster care for several years, he still had that burden. And Amy, who had not understood, she was 8 when this was going on, she hadn't understood how very ill her mother was, said to me, she said, this was a bright kid, but somewhat disturbed herself. She said to me, I see you have on a cross. Yeah. She said, does that mean you believe in God? And I said, yes, I believe in God. And she said, well, if you believe in God, now this is 8-year-old, do you believe in miracles? And I said, yes, I believe in miracles. And she said, well, don't you think there can be a miracle and my mommy will get better? Okay, if I were using that to judge best interest, what would I be telling the judge? I'd be saying she wants to wait for her mommy to get better. But I knew better than Amy. Not only that her mother was not likely to get better, but also that she couldn't wait for her mother to get better. And when I testify with Jane as the attorney, she usually just pushes the button and lets me talk. And
I get out of the way.
And the judges are usually pretty tolerant of that, especially if they're ones we've trained. And I can't wait for opposing counsel to ask me questions, because I've got an answer for every one. But what I started off by saying is whether Amy and Paul want to be adopted is not relevant. What's relevant is they need to be adopted. Okay, well, I was doing this presentation just like we are today in a small town in the South. And the way we had this set up was that we were doing volunteers in the evening, and then the next day we had a huge workshop planned for 400 or 500 people with the systems people there, social workers and mental health and school people and whatever. But the volunteers were getting a preview. They were allowed to come the next day as well, but many worked during the day, so we were doing a special session for them in the evening. And I got to this point in my story, despite the fact that we say we don't want a lot of questions, somebody raised their hand. And, you know, I like to be polite. I wasn't raised in the South, you probably know that, but I've tried to assimilate. Somebody raised their hand, and I said, yes, and she said, I don't understand why y'all didn't just accept this plan, why you didn't take the judge's plan. What was wrong with the judge's plan? It would have done your legal thing, and the kids would have had permanence. And I said, well, what you need to know is that kids need permanence they can believe in. And just because somebody says custody to a foster parent doesn't mean permanence to kids. I already told you my kids wanted to see the adoption papers. Oh, I'm working in an adoption agency now, and one of the things we do is try to make in North Carolina, we don't have a court hearing around the final decree. So my agency makes a ceremony out of it. And I have seen, literally, I have seen a 13-year-old drop to his knees because it says, adopted for life. And life is what it means to these kids, adopted for life. And so I told the judge that without a permanent attachment figure, kids cannot grow and develop. We're going to talk about this some more in the workshop tomorrow, so you're getting the very quick condensed version today. But basically, I'm going to tell you about attachment in about 10 minutes. What attachment really means is that somebody's taking care of you and you can trust them. It's all that continuity and reciprocity stuff. We get attached to people that take care of us. It's as simple as that. If they do a good job or a lousy job, we're still attached because they've given us what we needed, and we didn't have the capacity as infants, as young children, even as middle-aged children, to judge whether or not they were giving us everything we needed. So we become attached. Okay, once we're attached, conscience development begins. And the way you develop a conscience is very simple. And this is true, this is universal truth, Psych 101. Every child, you and me and the children we raise, develop a conscience the same way. We want to follow the rules put in front of us by parents we're attached to. Just as simple as that. And we want to follow the rules for two reasons and two reasons only. One is that we want to please the people we're attached to. And two, because they have power of life and death over us, we know that we'll be punished if we don't follow the rules. And punishment in the family that I grew up in, I was never spanked. And boy, I think maybe sometimes I needed to be, but I wasn't. But my father had a way of looking at you. He'd raise his eyebrows and you would know you're in deep trouble. And that's all it took. And I didn't want my daddy to be mad at me. So I shaped up. Well, actually, I shaped up, or I hid what I was doing better. But in those years of learning what was right and what values I should incorporate into my life, I was developing a conscience. Children are not born with a conscience. They're pretty much blank slates, and they may all be wired differently, hardwired differently, but basically they learn the lessons from the parents who tell them it's okay to do this, it's not okay to do that. And most of us tell our children that both verbally and through our behaviors. We live, hopefully, what we say. And our children develop a conscience around how we live our lives and what lessons we've taught them. Children in foster care do not have the opportunity to develop a conscience in the same way. Just think about this for a minute. It's like a tree with a whole bunch of tangled roots because they've been in their birth family and they've seen certain lessons. And they were attached to those people and they got lessons from those people. And then they went to the second family or the third or the fourth, and there were all these lessons leading to the tree of that child. And sometimes those roots are tangled, and oftentimes they're contradictory roots, and they squeeze out each other. And then something else goes on. Nick was actually in 4 placements before we got him. 2 of those were relative placements. And the relatives decided he was too young, too old, too much trouble, too whatever. You know how people do with kids. And so that ring around Nick got thinner and thinner. The parenting ring was so thin. And what that really translates into is, you're giving me 3 hots and a cot, but you're not giving me anything else, because I want to allow myself to take anything else from you. Because I'm not going to let myself get attached to you, because you are not there for me in the long run. Kids very quickly, whether they're this high or this high, begin to learn about continuity and reciprocity very quickly. If you were told to come here today, and when you got here, the room was locked, and you couldn't get in the door, and they said, oh, come back tomorrow, and we'll have the session, and you came back tomorrow, and the room was locked, you couldn't get in the door, would you come back the 3rd day? Hopefully not. Maybe not, hopefully not. You would know, you would have learned that you couldn't count on the word of the conference organizer. But when you got here today, the door was open, there was chairs set up, you could count on that word. That's a very tiny microcosmic look at what reciprocity means. Someone gives you their word and you can count on it. Well, the kids in our system have people giving them their word that they can't count on. So what happens to these kids is that they develop a problem with conscience. And it's partly because they don't have rules from people they can trust, or the rules are so tangled. And let me show you.
A little cartoon, but
this is a cartoon, but it's not a funny one. And it's from a book called Children Without a Conscience, a very scary book. But if you look at the end, Jane, I can't read all the
Yeah.
thing, maybe you can.
It goes from one end of extremely bonded and attached with the idea of Mother Teresa, Albert Schweitzer, to well to average bond, which is hopefully most of us, slightly impaired, slick salesmen and some politicians.
Not naming any names.
We're not naming any names. Partially bonded, thrill seekers and some spies, very weak bond, robbers, thieves, prostitutes, drug pushers, to extremely unbonded and unattached serial killers, sadists, Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, Joseph Mengele, etc.
And what that really shows, it's an illustration between bonding and attachment, because folks on the left side, you know, where we are, most of us, learned the rules from people we loved and trusted, and we were reinforced for learning those rules in a positive way. That's really what bonding and attachment is all about. When you get over here, some of those people, and this is not a reflection always on parents, and you know that about serial killers and whatever. Sometimes people are just hardwired differently, and we don't have enough time to get into all of the psychosocial and physiological reasons for bonding and attachment disorders. But this is a look at what happens if we fail to make sure children have an attachment figure. What we're doing is we're creating the next generation of monsters. And I personally plan to live to be old, and I probably will need some kind of assisted care, and I'd rather it not be from a monster. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So if you don't want to do this for the sake of the children, do it for your sake, or the sake of your children and the next generation, because we've got to make sure our kids have an attachment figure. Well, that's all about attachment. But let me tell you about grief and loss, because these two are inextricably, no, that's a hard word to say, entwined. You can't separate out grief and loss from attachment. And what happens to kids when they come into foster care is that they begin to grieve. Now, I can tell you, I'm going to make all the gentlemen in the room uncomfortable when I talk about this analogy. Analogies are my favorite thing. I was a young pre-med student when I had my first child. I was very young. And, you know, at that age, you know everything, right? And especially since I was in pre-med, I knew everything. And the doctor recommended circumcision. And back in those days, we had all, you know, unless there was a religious reason for waiting till the 8th day, the babies were circumcised in the hospital the day after they were born. And I agreed, but I did ask the doctor, well, is there any discomfort or pain? No, not a bit. Because what he told me was babies, newborns within a day of birth, don't have the same pain receptors developed, and say that they don't hurt. Well, what they did to my baby boy was strap him down and cut off the foreskin of his penis, and I know for a fact that it hurt because I've seen it done to babies since. It hurts. But we kidded ourselves into thinking that didn't hurt little baby boys. Now we know it hurts, and so we do it a little differently. We kidded ourselves for years that placement into foster care didn't hurt children. We, and I'm talking about the whole profession, believed that once we took children away from abusive or neglectful parents, we were doing them such a favor that if there was any discomfort, it was balanced by the benefit, just like the circumcision balanced out the pain. Well, it doesn't. I can tell you right up front, it doesn't. When we take a child away from their family, no matter how inadequate that family is, we're cutting off a piece of that child. It's just like an amputation. And just like if you have a limb that has gangrene in it, the doctor first tries to do everything he can to stem the infection and to cure the infection and to heal the wound way before he starts talking about an amputation. Well, that's what we do in foster care, to prevent foster care placement. That, to me, is what reasonable efforts are about. We're going to do what we can to stop that infection from going on. But just like the doctor who comes to the position that there is no way to stop the infection, we have to come to the position occasionally that there's no way to keep this family together, that that child will literally die if we don't remove him from that family, or that he'll be so damaged or so compromised that he might as well be dead. That's when we remove kids. And I'm comfortable with that, but don't think it doesn't come with a price. That child loses. And like every one of us in this room who's had a loss, that child grieves. Now the reason we were so ignorant about that for so long is because grief in kids looks different than grief in adults. We don't recognize grief in kids for two reasons. One, because they don't have the same grief mechanisms we do, so they don't look like us. And two, because we don't want to believe it's happening. Grieving in kids is really scary for adults, but I can guarantee you that there's never been a child removed from even the worst parent that doesn't grieve. Now, they may grieve over the loss of the fantasy parent. They may not be grieving for Mengele, but they're grieving over the parent that should have been or could have been. And this is true whether you remove the child when they're 1 day of age or 18 years of age. The child who's 1 day will not know it then, but every developmental stage that child goes through, they will be aware of the fact that they've had a loss. The sooner we do the removal, the less loss there'll be. However, there is a cost to pay.
Yeah, I thought I'd missed out on some of this because my children were so young. They had 30-day revocation periods back then for parents who released, and they were both 5 weeks old when I adopted them. And I remember my younger daughter, Catherine, who's now 17, one morning when I was getting ready to go just for a day trip, being worried because the weather was so bad. And she wasn't sure she wanted me to be driving, and I was trying to reassure her. And as I walked out of her room, I said, "Don't worry, I'll be back this afternoon, this evening. Everything's fine. You have a great day." She was 8 years old, and she looked at me and she said, "Well, if you die, I will have lost 2 mommies." Now, she never knew her mother, of course. The point is, at some point, you grow up and you realize, and they start realizing it when you tell them where babies come from. My children always knew they were adopted, but adopted doesn't mean anything to a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. It's just a book they look at and, some stuff they hear occasionally. But then they realize that some babies grow in a tummy of a mother, and they didn't grow in my tummy, and they have to deal with it, as Jana said. Now, she didn't have to deal with a lot of other losses, but we dealt with that already with my 23-year-old, and all I'm saying is that I didn't escape it because it can't be escaped. I will always be their mom, and I will never be their birth mother. That is simply their reality, shared by only about 5% of our population.
Now, that's not to say kids shouldn't be adopted, because they absolutely should be, and that's also not to say that every child is going to be as sensitive as Catherine, or as inquisitive as Anne Elizabeth, or as angry as Mark. Some of our kids are more resilient. They're hardwired differently. They can go with the flow and take the blows easier. But I want you to take a minute with me, and I'm not going to do this for long because I can't do it for long, but I want you to think about a loss you've had. My dad died 10 years ago, and my mom died a year ago. And when she died, it brought back all the loss of him. When my dad died, I was a total wreck, but I was more of a wreck when my mom died because I realized I was dealing with the loss piled on top of the loss, and that was a lesson I had missed for our kids, that every loss compounds every other loss, especially if they're the same kind of loss. You can lose a spouse or a friend, and it doesn't feel the same as several parents or parents over time like our kids do. When my dad died, I was absolutely incapable of doing anything for several weeks. I mean, I was a total mess. I had a wonderful husband. I had 6 children. I had a great job. I had a strong church support family. I had all kinds of friends. The only thing that changed in my world when my dad died was that my dad died. For the children that we are taking care of, when they lose a parent, they don't just lose a parent. They lose everything in their world. They lose the taste, the sounds, the smells, and the touches of their world. They lose their parents, their friends, their toys, their schools, and most often their siblings. Everything is gone. I could barely survive as a 40-some-year-old adult the loss of my father. I don't know how these kids survive the loss of everything in their worlds. I don't know how they do it. It just amazes me that they get through it at all. And we have got to be cognizant of what they're going through. This comes with a great cost. Our intervention comes with a huge cost to those children. Okay, like the doctor, we had to do the amputation. but don't be fooled by the fact that that child's still missing something. And what we do is we give them a prosthesis. We put them in a good foster home, and that foster home does a good job of parenting. But they're damaged, and there's that continuity and reciprocity issue that's been raised because that's been broken. And now they're not sure that it's going to be continued, and so they're holding back a little bit. And then there's the next removal. The average child on the foster care system in the United States of America has 3 placements before reunification or adoption occurs. The average child. My daughter Barbara had 17 different sets of caregivers before we adopted her. Imagine the amputations. Imagine what we had left to parent. I was in a conference with foster parents a couple of years ago, actually now nearly 10, and they were giving awards to foster and adoptive parents, and a bunch of them paraded up and said, thank you for my children, and thank you for this award, and, you know, my life is so enriched, and blah, 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 blah. And we were all, you know, smiling, patting ourselves on the back. And then this one lady got up. She had adopted 5 children and then 5 more. And she got the big award. And she got up, and we all expected her to be, you know, gracious and whatever, a big award. I think, in fact, we gave her, like, money or something. And she said, you know, I'm grateful for the award, thank you, but you need to hear me say something else. She said, first, I want you to know I love my children, and I'm glad we adopted them. But I also want you to know that I live with your mistakes. I took a deep breath because I thought I was one of the good guys, and then I realized that I had made a bunch of mistakes along the way. And that's what I want you to hear. You didn't place my children with me, but I live with your mistakes, the mistakes of people just like you in this system. The children that I have parented have brought me a lot of joy and a lot of grief. Their pain has been my pain, and they have caused me a whole different set of pain. Their damage causes damage all around them. They cannot recover from that damage without parents to take care of them. And they cannot get parents to take care of them if they have been so damaged that nobody wants to touch them. It's very hard to take a child who refuses to be parented and parent that child. Let me tell you how kids get to that point. Claudia Jewett has written a book called Adopting the Older Child, and it has a very important lesson in there for all of us. And I've actually expanded on her lesson because I think she meant to say more. She says every child is born with 2 shiny buckets in their little hands, and those buckets get full of positive stuff. Emily's buckets were full very early on. I mean, this was a child that was so much desired. There was a huge gathering at the hospital when she was born, wild celebration, and she also is adorable and loving. How'd she get that way? Well, some of that is hopefully good genetics, but some of it, frankly, is that her buckets got full. From the very first, she was told how wonderful she was, how much she was loved, how much she was cared for, and she was cared for. She was given everything she needed physically and emotionally. So the buckets got full up. And Emily is brimming over with love. People who meet her are amazed at how loving and affectionate and charming she is. Well, she got her buckets full. My daughter Barbara was born into a family where her mother was mentally ill and her father was a scoundrel. And early on, those buckets not only weren't getting full up, but holes were being put in the buckets by the fact that she wasn't being fed properly. She wasn't being taken to the doctor. She didn't have immunizations. She and her older brother shared a crib. He was 13 months older than she. He was 13 months bigger. He took the bottle that was propped for both of them, and she didn't get anything. She weighed just a few pounds at a year old. I mean, she was pitiful. Placed in foster care when she was 11 months old. And there she remained until we met her when she was 8. Barbara's buckets were pretty much damaged by her parents, but much more damaged by her foster care experience. She was placed over the 7 years that she was in custody of Department of Social Services with a variety of relatives, some foster parents, and finally, when she was 4 1/2, the youngest age they would accept her, she joined her siblings, there were 6 altogether, in a group home. And in that group home, she was abused and neglected as well. She was also separated from her siblings almost immediately. She was in the 4-year-old cottage, and Mark was in the boys' 5-year-old cottage, and there were other siblings that were older, and then 2 of them ran away. And long story short, Barbara had, probably while she was in that placement, about 11 different sets of caregivers in 5 or 6 different cottages. And when she came to us, the amputations were so great, she could not emotionally walk. She also had these buckets that were pretty badly battered, because what happens when kids, even if somebody is doing a good job parenting them, even the boys I told you about with Mrs. Jones who were getting their buckets full of love from her, there were still those holes in the buckets and things leak out. And when you have low buckets, you can't give very much back. You can't. Even if the child wants to, they cannot take a risk because that bucket is their lifeblood. You know yourself, if you're having a bad day, if you're down, if you're low, if your buckets are low, you're not much good about giving affection. You're not even very much good about receiving affection. So these kids come to us and their buckets are already damaged. And then after the 5th or 6th placement, and I don't know what the magic number is, there's some placement for some kids that just they say no more. And what they do is they clamp a lid on the bucket, because that's the biggest hole of all. And it's the only one they can control. So they put a lid on the bucket, and what does that mean? Well, that means they're not available to be parented. You can't get anything into the bucket. Imagine trying to parent a child that will not take parenting from you. Well, you pull at the lid of that bucket until your fingernails break off, until you bleed all over the bucket, and then I live with your mistakes. Because that's what happens to children who cannot be parented. They get labeled, they get tossed aside, and they get down that continuum. Okay, so all of that is going on with kids, and we haven't even talked about grief and loss except to tell you that it's like an amputation. But the other thing that's going on with kids who are grieving that is very important for you to recognize and very important for you to understand is that normal grief in kids looks abnormal. I told you that when my dad died, I was like totally useless, even with my support system. But what happened was my boss said, take all the time off you need. My husband said, don't worry that you lost your keys for the 4th time. I've made extra keys for you. My kids said, it's okay, Mom, we'll do dinner tonight. There was a group of people that took care of my needs, personally, professionally, emotionally. Our kids are removed from their families, they're grieving, and we put them in school the next day and expect them to perform. Well, I could not remember, when I'd get in my car, I couldn't remember where I was supposed to go. And what I would do is turn around and go home and say, I can't work today. Can our kids do that? Can our kids come home from school and say, can't work today? No, they can't. They're disciplined for not working. They're disciplined for not paying attention, and then they get labeled. When kids are grieving, so much energy goes into the grief process. And you know yourself, when you've had a loss, you're so tired. It's tiring to grieve. It's painful to grieve. And you can't deal with a whole bunch of other stuff. And you also can't learn your multiplication tables. Now, when you're 40 and your dad dies, you don't have to learn your multiplication tables and somebody takes care of you. But when you're 4 and you've been removed from your parents and you're supposed to learn how to tie your shoes or eat some funny food that someone's putting in front of you or obey these new rules that you didn't even know were rules in anybody's world, all of a sudden you start to look weird and different from every other kid. So grief comes with a big, big, big cost to our kids. They look different than other kids. Their development is delayed because of the grief. And because of the grief, they're afraid to attach. Because what really happens when the kids put the lid on the buckets, they say, I'm not going to take any more risks. You people have cut off too many pieces of me. I'm not going to get close to you and take a risk that you're going to cut off another piece of me. So that's what the system does to kids. What I tell parents when I'm working with birth parents, I tell them about the amputation, and I acknowledge that we have done some of that. But we did it because they put the infection there. Now, they have some choices. They can help us clear up the infection in their own lives so we can get their kids back, or they can recognize that we can't wait for their kids to get damaged some more. What I tell them is, it's like your kids are out in the winter without a coat. We can't give them a coat because the coat requires that you step away or you step up. So your kids are out in the winter without a coat. How long are you going to let that go on? When ASFA was first passed, one of the controversial issues about ASFA was a year to permanence, and people were saying, oh, well, it took 7 years for this person. They're addicted to drugs. They've been on drugs for 7 years. It's going to take them that long to get, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, you're right. It probably will, it may take them 10 years to get clean and sober. I'm sorry, that kid cannot wait. They have chosen not to parent, and I can't wait, because in the meantime, their child's not only growing up without them, which if that were the only cost, that would be bad enough, but their child is moving from home to home. We're cutting off more pieces of them. We're teaching them values that are conflicting. We're giving them a very clear message that they might as well not develop any sense of conscience, because there's never going to be anyone there to hold them accountable for that, because they're going to get to move pretty soon anyway. We're creating monsters, and we can't do that. So I'm sorry about parents who have conditions that don't improve. I'm sorry about parents who don't get the message soon enough, because their kids are out in the cold without a coat, and I'm going to bring them in.
One of the things I think you can do as a guardian ad litem CASA is advocate for these children and tell people, have you thought about grief? If you go and you talk to a school teacher of a child that you've just been assigned to, if that school teacher knew that that child's hamster died last night, she'd cut that child a break, wouldn't she? If she knew that their parents were talking about getting divorced, she would cut that child a break. But instead, that child's brand new and in foster care. Get with the program. And one of the things Jane will tell you is that when we grieve, we get angry. But you know what? We're adults and we have governors. As Jane used to say, she was so angry at the doctors when her dad died. But she had governors, and she didn't go up and hit him upside the head. Child doesn't have governors. He hit somebody. So we've got to teach ourselves about grief. It's all in the book, several chapters, so you can advocate for them. Jane said those things in court, and the judge terminated parental rights. And he later said it had nothing to do with me. Jane was the star, so, get over it. I said, thanks a lot. And we're going to tell you the rest of that story later today.
Yeah, there's more to the Paul and Amy story, but let me tell you the end of the story. The woman who raised her hand before I started talking. I spent a little more time that day, I think, talking about conscience development and also self-esteem. That was the thing I really left out today. It's part of the presentation tomorrow, but self-esteem develops when you feel like somebody loves you. It's really that simple. And when you're not sure that somebody loves you and is connected to you, you're not sure you're worth anything. And I talked about that to the judge and why you need to have that legal piece so you can relax and trust and know your bucket's going to be full and whatever. And when I finished my presentation, the woman who had asked the question was crying. And we took a break then, and I went up to her, because I'm a social worker, and I wanted to fix it. And I was, wanting to know why she was crying. I didn't think I'd done that bad a job. So I asked her, I said, is there something I can do to help? And she kind of pulled herself together, and she said, you made me realize something about myself. And I said, what's that? And she said, well, first you need to know that I'm a foster child. Now, this woman sitting there was probably in her mid-40s. She was dressed far better than I was. In fact, she went on to tell me that she had a successful company, a business, that she drove a Mercedes, that you'd never know, that she had this huge hole in her heart, but that she was a foster child. And she had not realized until that moment where that hole came from, why she felt inadequate, why she didn't trust people, why she always waited for the other shoe to drop, why she didn't have a reciprocal relationship with a man when she desperately wanted one but couldn't trust anyone that had come into her life. And all of a sudden that all came together for her, and she was grieving over that right then. And I said, well, what's your story? What happened to you? And she proceeded to tell me really a very nice story, that she had been placed in foster care when she was 8. She had grown up with the same set of foster parents, so she could identify with my little boys that Mrs. Jones told me I was killing. She had grown up with the same set of foster parents. She was their only child. They loved her, but they never adopted her. So she was sure something was wrong with her. She was an overachiever because she was sure she had to continue to win their affection and their love. She was sure that she was not good enough because Why wouldn't, if they say they love you, why wouldn't they adopt you? Well, I took a big risk, and I suggested that she ask that question, that she call. Her dad was deceased, she told me that. But her mom was still alive. She was 72, 3 years old. And I said, why don't you call her tonight and ask her? Just ask her why, because it's a question you need to have answered. So,
She did. And she came in the next day, and she looked like she was floating. The weight was gone, and she said she found out that her story was a little bit different, that she actually came to them earlier because her father was an alcoholic. And guess what? She got reunified with her father. Her birth mother had never been in her life. And guess what? It didn't last. About 6 months later, he fell off the wagon, and he was trying desperately to avoid social services coming for her again. So he approached the foster parents, and he said, we can both win. If social services gets her again, you won't get her, because back then, if you fostered, you didn't adopt it. Isn't that great? You don't get attached to these children. We're waiting for the right adoptive parents to come along. So you won't get her, and I'll lose her, but I've got a win-win. You keep her, and I'll get to visit her. And so they did, and they kept her a secret for all those years, afraid to come forward, afraid to do anything. Even after he faded away, she didn't even remember her dad.
he quickly faded
Right,
away.
he quickly faded, but they were afraid to approach the system, afraid to approach an attorney. And then I guess when she got grown, they thought, well, what's the point? She's grown. And she told us that that night, on the phone, they had come to the decision that they were going to do an adult adoption. And in fact, Jane has a hairdresser who told her that that was what she wanted for her 40th birthday.
Well, we were just chatting. You know, she knows what I do for a living, and we were chatting, and her birthday was coming up, and I said, well, you know, what's Ricky going to give you for your birthday? And she said, you're going to think I'm crazy, but you know what I want? I want Mama to adopt me. And I'm like, what? See, Mama had always been a presence in this little home hairdressing thing. She was sitting over in the corner. I'm like, Lily? You mean Lily? And she said, oh, yeah, you didn't know Lily was not my birth mother. Lily was my mother's sister and took me in when I was a baby because my mother was 16 and wild and crazy. But I want to be adopted at 40. No social service involvement, nothing, but she needed that claiming. Lily didn't even know her way to the courthouse by then. Poor Lily was... Lily had moved on mentally.
But it was okay.
It was okay. Sandra was going to be adopted.
You have a handout on long-term foster care, and we need to move on in order to finish, and we're going to give you a quick break in just 1 second. But if you take a look at it, an impermanent solution, what we want you to take away is you are never too young and you are never too old to need a family. So if you get involved in a case in which nobody really wants this to be the plan, but it looks like it's going to be the plan, we're going to back into long-term foster care. Here's some things to think about. Number one, redouble your efforts. And don't assume that any child is unadoptable. Do you know a child is as unadoptable as you think a child is unadoptable? When you make a mental decision the child is unadoptable, that pretty much does that child in. So go back and revisit his past and revisit possible attachment figures in his life that could step up to that legal plate. Now, we also live in the real world, and we know there are children who at age 18, 17, probably are not going to accept parenting right now. Or they have such special needs, medically, you know, emotionally, physically, whatever, that it's not probably going to happen for them. But what every person in this world needs, even if we can't put the legal ring around it, is an attachment figure. So you need to go find an attachment figure.